I spent the last couple of months trying to figure out why you shouldn't get the iPhone 13 Pro over the iPhone 14 Pro, and honestly, the price difference is the only deciding factor. But before you go out and buy one of these phones, I'm going to tell you if the iPhone 13 Pro is still worth it in 2023. Hello everyone, this is Matt from Real World Review. Pause if you want to see what I normally say. Okay, so now we can get started. Now let's not act like we don't know the assumption that pretty much everyone has, saying that the last generation iPhone is the same as the current generation iPhone. Clearly, that statement is wrong every single time, but it is still on the right path. It always feels like the last iPhone is the same as a current iPhone, and the iPhone 13 Pro and 14 Pro follow this statement. So really, this video is for people that want one of those phones and just can't decide. Easily, if you have the money, get the iPhone 14 Pro. If you don't, 13 Pro it is. But don't click off this video yet because you're missing, well, everything. With the exception of the iPhone 14 Pro having a very few more pixels, both phone screens are pretty much identical, being almost 2K displays with a max refresh rate of 120 Hz, dropping down to 1 or 10 Hz on the 14 Pro and 13 Pro, respectively. This allows the 14 Pro to get the always-on display, but just like the Apple Watch, it's not as exciting as what other companies do. And even after iOS 16.2, my phone does this weird glitch. So yeah, it is a cool addition, but I leave it off. So for me, the 13 Pro and the 14 Pro are pretty much the same in that aspect. The screen refresh rate is also supposed to give you better battery life, but it doesn't really do anything for me. As for brightness, it is the same, but different. For normal usage, they both have the same 1000 nits of brightness. That's for most YouTube videos, Facebook, and Twitter viewing. The 13 Pro and 14 Pro support HDR and go up to 1200 and 1600 nits respectively, and the 14 Pro goes all the way up to 2000 nits in the sunlight, while the 13 Pro stays at that 1200. Hopefully I didn't lose you with all those numbers. The screens are both OLED, both 6.1 inches, both flat, and both have notches. The small notch is on the 13 Pro, and Notch Island is on the 14 Pro, which you can turn into a sideways lowercase I, or exclamation point depending on how you look at it, when you ask, and take up more space than a normal notch. But hey, at least you can't see if you're on Wi-Fi or 5G anymore. Now the processor is the same, but not, of course. The iPhone 13 Pro has a top-end A15 Bionic chip, and the 14 Pro has the A16 Bionic chip. Both are 6-core processors with 5-core GPUs and the 16-core neural processor, not to mention 6GB of RAM. In tests, the iPhone 14 Pro is, on average, 8% faster, processor-wise, and 7% faster, graphic-wise. Real-world testing, however, does show a slight boost in demanding games, but in literally every single app that I use, the speed is the same. Sure, camera processing might be slightly faster in the background, but let's be honest, these are the same chip. I really hate saying that, and technically it's not true, but it definitely feels true. Both come in 3GB sizes, being 128, 256, or 512GB, or 1TB formats. So yes, you're literally seeing 2TB of iPhones on your screen right now. Powering the phone, the battery is bigger, and that is true. The iPhone 12 Pro to 13 Pro to 14 Pro have seen a slight battery increase year over year, and I'm not going to ignore that. However, Apple claims a simple 1 hour more of video playback, and honestly 23 hours is insane and would literally be 0.52 watts per hour of usage, which is insanely low for having a screen on. But either way, Apple's claims are pretty reasonable in the differences aspect because the iPhone 14 Pro is bigger than the iPhone 13 Pro by 3.3%. Yep, lower than the processors, going from 11.97 watt-hours to 12.38 watt-hours. And yes, it seems like Apple rounded up that 0.41 watt-hour difference to 0.52, I guess. I mean, the battery life is good in the first place, so the differences will only be good if you're considering buying a phone that is heavily used versus the iPhone 14 Pro, which will have a battery that's most likely not as used as a used 13 Pro. Charging speeds, wireless charging, all the same, maxing out at about 23 watts wired and 7.5 watts wireless, while MagSafe does 15 watts. Realistically, they both get you through the day, and if they don't, push this button on the side of the phone, set your phone down, and go outside for a little bit. Speaking of buttons, they've moved, sort of. The side button is slightly lower on the iPhone 14 Pro, and that's about it. The phone sizes are actually different too, with the iPhone 13 Pro literally being slightly smaller in every way, including weight. You still get the same ceramic shield on the front and the back, stainless steel midband, and IP68 dust and water resistance. Same loud dual speakers on the front and bottom. If I had to guess, I would say the iPhone 14 Pro is better, but not by much. As for connectivity, the iPhone 14 Pro is slightly better, starting with Bluetooth 5.3 support over the 5.0 on the 13 Pro. They both have the same Wi-Fi support and 5G support, with the exception of a few more 5G bands on the iPhone 14 Pro. You do, however, get dual frequency GPS, which helps with navigation in dense building areas, as well as satellite connectivity for emergency situations. So if you get the iPhone 13 Pro, don't get lost in the forest, I guess. There is SIM support and eSIM support on both phones, but the US models of the 14 series drop the SIM, meaning that you only get eSIM support, again, only in the US. Most countries outside of the US still sell SIM models for the iPhone, and that's it. Yeah, the cameras are slightly different, but not enough to really bring it up right now. Okay, fine, on the 14 Pro, the front camera does focus. The rear camera is now 48 megapixels, but mainly shoots 12 megapixel shots, but that also means slightly better night mode and an optical 2x shot. Another thing I noticed is the 14 Pro's focus distance is farther than the 13 Pro, and it's become something that I've noticed a lot, making me prefer the 13 Pro camera over the 14 Pro. They made cinematic mode actually work with 4K 24 or 30 frames per second capturing on the 14 Pro. You also get this action mode that only goes up to 2.8K at 60 frames per second, so think a bigger and better GoPro. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there's little stuff like the photonic engine and the camera flash being different, but come on. Now we're a little over 1,000 words going into this review talking about the differences, so yeah, I guess you can say that it is different, but not that much. The camera section seems to be the only difference, and even the images and videos come out looking pretty much the same. Just like the rest of the phone, small additions that make sense, but also cost more. Okay, let's actually talk about the camera going back to the iPhone 13 Pro, but I did have to bring up what you would gain from spending more and getting the iPhone 14 Pro. But for the cameras, I wouldn't say that they're a good enough reason to upgrade to the 14 Pro. Starting with the front camera, I'm glad that the 14 Pro focuses, but there's a reason why it didn't focus for the longest time. The iPhone 13 Pro has a 12 megapixel sensor that's a fixed focus, but it didn't prevent from taking some pretty sharp shots. Not to mention, we still get portrait mode, cinematic video, and normal 4K 60 frames per second video out of this sensor. I mean, it's an iPhone front camera. We know what it does. The rear cameras, however, are also 12 megapixel sensors, and they have their own strengths. The ultra-wide is a focusable sensor that produces some spectacular shots, as well as some nice macro shots. Most of the time. I'm still not a fan of this addition because the 14 Pro confirmed my suspicion. The minimum focus distance on the main camera is actually farther away than the iPhone 12 Pro, with the 14 Pro being even farther than the 13 Pro. What this means is that when you put stuff up to the camera, it actually has to be a certain distance away from the camera for the main camera to focus. It's fine and wasn't too bad on the 13 Pro though, because the iPhone 14 Pro actually made me realize that Apple even does this in the first place. With that said, macro shots are just not the best for every time on this phone, and using the main sensor actually works better in some of those situations, especially when there's less light. Still looks pretty good though if you do give it a lot of light. Moving to the main sensor, this is optically stabilized by the sensor shift technology that was found in the 12 Pro Max, which doesn't really mean much because Apple stabilization has pretty much always been on point. And I'm not even kidding when I say this, whether we're talking about photos and especially on videos, this is identical to the iPhone 14 Pro, quality-wise. There may be some minor strengths that the 14 Pro has, but not enough for me to really even notice. The camera uses the LiDAR sensor in the back to assist with focusing, and has never let me down, actually sometimes working better than the iPhone 14 Pro. And like I said, besides the improvement to cinematic mode, this one only being 1080p at 30 frames per second, and the fact that the 14 Pro has action mode while the 13 Pro doesn't, recording is ultimately the same quality. Even with the 48 megapixel sensor, the image is still pretty much the same and binned down to 12 megapixels for normal shots. So if you're just taking normal pictures and pretty much any video, either phone will work for you. And lastly, we get the 3x telephoto sensor, which again is optically stabilized, but the normal type, and feels like the same sensor that we get on the 14 Pro. I can't really even see a difference in this one, but I will admit that the 3x zoom is sometimes a little bit too much for the situation, so I do see the appeal of the 2x capability that is on the 14 Pro. It's ironic because Apple actually made this problem going from the 2.5x on the 12 Pro to the 3x on the 13 Pro, and then they fixed the issue with the 14 Pro. But in my eyes, I would say that this camera set is the same quality as the iPhone 14 Pro, but I'll let you be the true judge. Now hopefully you feel like this video has really explained the differences between the iPhone 13 Pro and the 14 Pro, because that's generally what you need to do when you review an iPhone. The evolution of iPhones are kind of basic in that sense and generally just get better or stay the same, just like the durability of the phone and the Face ID not improving when moving to the 14 Pro. But the main reason people want to look into reviews is because of the price. Right now, I cannot buy the iPhone 13 Pro from Apple, but most carriers will have this for $100 less than the 14 Pro, and at that price, 14 Pro every day. But moving into the big brain market, I mean the used market, we are looking at about a $250 to $350 price difference, possibly being even more depending on when I drop this video, and that's where the 13 Pro looks more convincing. If I had to give a price difference from the 13 Pro to the 14 Pro, I would say that the 14 Pro is maybe $50 better, not $100, and definitely not an average of $300 better. Sure, pricing will change over time, but even the 12 Pro and 13 Pro price difference is less than $200 and absolutely worth it in the display alone. Ultimately, it's your phone and your money, but getting the iPhone 13 Pro in a good condition sounds better than a phone that, at this time, only has a depreciation rate of 3%. Now I know this was talking a lot about the iPhone 14 Pro, but today we're talking about the iPhone 13 Pro, which is the better phone. Now clearly I don't mean that from where I stand, I mean that for someone that's looking to buy one, and it'll work perfectly for you. It's like Apple's M1 MacBooks and the M2 MacBooks. If you're already looking at the MacBook Pro M2, sure, it is better than the M1 version, but the M1 version is already really good. Sticking to the iPhone 13 Pro is technically not the best option because clearly the iPhone 14 Pro is the best as of now, but the 13 Pro is still a dramatically good phone, and probably the phone I would be using daily if I didn't have this channel. And that's the general sentiment for the 14 Pro, is that most people on YouTube bought it for the views, not because we really felt like we needed it. There was something wrong with Apple's phone lineup, and Apple filled that void with the iPhone 13 Pro, with the 14 Pro being slightly better. With that said, neither of them have USB-C, so the clear choice in the beginning had to be to buy the iPhone 13 Pro. And honestly, sorry for this video, I feel like it's been very long and very confusing, but that's how it feels trying to decide from the 13 Pro to the 14 Pro. And that's pretty much my review of the iPhone 13 Pro, the best iPhone for the price. Thanks for enduring almost half of this video literally talking about the differences, but I feel like that's the most important part. If you want more information on the iPhone 13 Pro, I do have a 20-minute ad-free review for this phone that you can enjoy. And that's it for my self-promotion. Hope you enjoyed all this video, and as always, thanks for watching.